Hello, everyone. I'm Gabriele Finaldi, Director of the National Gallery. Welcome to the second annual Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery. This series brings distinguished personalities from the fields of culture, academia, and museums to explore themes relating to the National Gallery's history and its collections. Some of you, slightly older ones perhaps, recall the original series. You may recall the original series of Linbury Lectures held between 1992 and 2002, devoted primarily to the Renaissance. Our present series is broader in scope, and we began it in 2019 with Laurence Descartes, director of the Musée d'Orsay, on how her museum and the National Gallery recount the art of the 19th century. Somehow, however, we tend to revert to type here at the National Gallery, and today's lecture by Professor Salvatore Settis brings us back to the Renaissance. So too actually will the subsequent Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery, which will be held later this year, when Professor Joseph Kerner will be speaking on Dürer on the occasion of the National Gallery's exhibition, Dürer's Journeys, Travels of a Renaissance Artists. Today's lecture is also connected with a National Gallery exhibition, Titian, Love, Desire, Death, which brought together Titian's 6 Poesie, the late mythologies painted for Philip II of Spain. The exhibition has had a long run at the gallery, but it will be sadly dismantled on Monday during the current lockdown without being able to reopen to the public. It has the dubious honor of being the only temporary art exhibition that I think has been closed 3 times by the current world pandemic. Before I introduce tonight's Linbury lecturer, I'd like to extend our thanks to the Linbury Trust for supporting the second series of lectures, A Generation On from the First. I'm particularly pleased that Lord and Lady Sainsbury are online listening with us. The lecture will last just under an hour. After it is over, Professor Settis will be in conversation for about 20 minutes with the National Gallery's curator of Italian 16th century painting and curator of the Titian exhibition, Dr. Matthias Vivel. After that, the speaker will take some questions from the audience. So please, if you want to ask a question, click on the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and write them in there, and I will moderate at the end. You can do so during the course of the talk and indeed of the conversation afterwards. It's a great pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Salvatore Settis, eminent archaeologist and art historian. He was director of the Getty Research Institute in the 1990s and director of the Scuola Normale di Pisa until 2010. Since the 1960s, he's been publishing extensively and brilliantly on ancient and Renaissance art, on Phidias, on Giorgione, on Trajan's Column, on the Laocoon, and on many other subjects. In recent time, he's been an eloquent advocate for the preservation of the Italian heritage, sometimes clashing fiercely, but always courteously, with politicians and administrators, and arguing his case, often our case too, as the general public, as in publications such as Landscape, Constitution, and Concrete, The Battle for the Environment Against Civil Degradation in 2010, and in 2016, If Venice Dies. I had the pleasure of hosting him as chair of the Prado Professorship some years ago, when he spoke about the history of drawing from antiquity to the 17th century. Professor Settis chairs the Scientific Council of the Louvre, and he is the curator of an exhibition on the Torlonia marbles, collecting masterpieces. That's the extraordinary but little known collection of ancient marbles in the Torlonia collection, which is currently on at the Capitoline Museums and will be for some months. His lecture this evening, the second Linbury lecture at the National Gallery, is titled Deeper Thoughts Beyond the Allegory of Bellini, Giorgione, and Titian. So without further ado, Professor Salvatore Settis.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be, if only virtually, at the National Gallery for a Linbury lecture, and I thank Gabriele Finaldi for his generous invitation. My talk is meant as a tribute to Titian's Poesie, first shown together in a unique exhibition I will unfortunately miss. While the Poesie belonged to a late stage of the master's life, I will focus on a much earlier period when, I will argue, the young Titian adopted in his pictorial language an exquisitely metaphorical register rivaling poetry's evocative power. Yet Titian was not alone. From about 1500, a few Venetian painters, including Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, and Titian, displayed sophisticated inventions and compositions, which, in order to be fully grasped, required lengthy observation as well as reference to highly codified poetic allusions and moral or intellectual meanings. This revolutionary novelty subverted the hierarchies between the various genres of painting sanctioned by Leon Battista Alberti's On Painting. For him, the greatest challenge for a painter was history painting, such as St. Mark in Alexandria, painted by Gentile Bellini and completed after his death by his brother Giovanni. Enlivened with an exotic urban landscape, including fanciful towers, an obelisk, and a large temple hinting at St. Mark's Basilica, this large canvas parades the saint's appearance among dignitaries in Venetian or Oriental dress, camels, and a number of diminutive incidents. Two words I just brought up, namely invention and composition, are drawn from rhetoric that all along the 15th and 16th centuries provided the dominant framework and the privileged language for high culture. Rhetoric means a technology of persuasion to be achieved through the careful construction of verbal discourse. Its classical theory, that survived more or less intact in medieval treatises and schools, involved the sequence of 5 parts or moments. Of these parts, the first was invention, i.e., the initial moment of the creative process, and this very word was frequently used also when talking about painting, while, as shown by Michael Baxendale, Alberti called composition the stage in which the invention was translated into a specific articulation of the discourse or image. A number of documents and literary texts bear witness that around 1500, the invention rested with the intention of the patron to which the painter was expected to conform, while the painter was mainly responsible for the composition. Alongside history painting, devotional pictures were also viewed as prestigious. They were predominantly iconic, yet often featured narrative elements. For example, Giovanni Bellini's Virgin and Child in Brera includes a landscape rich in episodes, a monkey on an altar bearing the painter's signature, a horseman, a shepherd with his flock, and so forth. As argued by John Sherman, a painting like this implies not just a representation of a subtle interplay between mother and child, but also the evocation of the beholder summoned by the very gaze of Mary and Jesus to complete the painting by figuratively entering its perceptive and compositional space. Other paintings, such as Bellini's panel with a lady on her toilette, hardly fit within a hierarchy in terms of genre, such as that I just mentioned. The format of this picture, painted in 1515, when the master was in his 80s, is oblong, like the Brera Madonna, and it is similarly centered on a young woman of great beauty who, however, ignores the observer while she looks at herself in a mirror. There are actually 2 mirrors. She holds the smaller with her right hand, while a larger one hangs on the wall behind her. The mirror on the wall reflects the back of her head, covered by a hairnet adorned with pearls, and her forearm. By playing with 2 mirrors, she is actually arranging her sophisticated hairdo. Who might this young lady be? Her appearance is so unusual in Bellini's oeuvre that we are tempted to explain it, as did Jennifer Fletcher, by an actual classical source, a torso of Venus, allegedly by Praxiteles, which the master inherited from his brother Gentile. The character of the painting has been interpreted accordingly as Venus herself, or a personification of vanity. Seated on a bench, covered by a red drapery and an oriental carpet, her body links two contrasting pictorial dimensions, a window opening onto a luminous, distant landscape, and the dark wall of her room hinting at the intimacy of the scene. A red cloth highlights her nudity, while a lovely glass jar with a sponge is placed on the window's inner ledge. What we are looking at is a woman inadvertently caught by a male gaze, that of the patron of the picture, while she is taking pleasure in her beauty. This exquisite composition is a distinctly contemplative painting, a pictorial and lyrical invention built around the strategies of the gaze, I would say. In order to ensure his male client the privilege of observing unseen a private moment of almost sacred solitude, the painter captured first the woman's gaze, multiplied and refracted by the two mirrors. Whether or not she was intended as the client's beloved, Bellini projected his alluring young lady towards a subtle metaphorical impersonality, revealing the thoughts of the intended viewer much more than her own. This intimate non-portrait embodies a delicately poetic language that would be unthinkable without the reference to a pair of sonnets where Petrarch pictures his beloved Laura in the privacy of her room, absorbed in contemplating her own beauty in one or more mirrors. In both sonnets, and here is the first one, the poet himself rebukes Laura for being too busy looking at herself in the mirror and therefore neglecting her lover. To quote only a few lines from Sonnet 45, mirror my enemy, line 1, and then on line 9, that mirror wouldn't have made you proud and harsh, pleasing to yourself, to my harm. Non deve a specchio farvi per mio danno. And then the mention of Narcissus in the following line. In the following sonnet, Petrarch laments his tearful life, and if Laura's beauty turns into an instrumental torture for him, he blames the mirrors, ma più ne colpo I micidiali specchi. This apostrophe to Laura is but a fiction, whereby the poet fancies what he would say if only she were listening. Yet, by describing his own sorrow while at once paying homage to her beauty, Petrarch is chiefly talking about himself. This was a common motif in love poetry, the beautiful and unresponsive beloved, her lover's suffering, and his effort to earn her attention through his poetry. Yet, Bellini's painting is by no means an illustration of Petrarch's sonnet. The painter took certain narrative elements from them, such as the woman admiring herself in a mirror, but he fully merged them with the pictorial conventions familiar to his patron. The landscape, for instance. It reminds us of the one on either side of the Brera Madonna, but is shifted towards a new expressive function. Here, the landscape is on one side only, and its dissymmetry with the darkness of the bedroom stresses the privacy of the domestic space. Poetic memory blends intimately with pictorial language, and the additional features, such as nudity, are calibrated to an ethical as well as erotic atmosphere that compares to that of Petrarch. As the poet at his writing desk saw the patron of this painting in his studiolo, is dreaming of an unlikely dialogue with his beloved. Yet they also define themselves through their highly codified longing. A Petrarchan atmosphere has invaded the pictorial language. Bellini's painting we are looking at excludes the lover from the pictorial space while implying his gaze in the equally private space of his home. But a painting by Titian, likely from the same year, 1515, subverts the composition by bringing the lover inside the painting and making him interact with the equally beautiful but elaborately clothed woman. Here too, there are two mirrors, both supported by the elegant young man who helps his beloved to do her hair. With his left hand, he adjusts the inclination of a large concave mirror resting on a piece of furniture behind. His right hand holds a smaller mirror where the woman directs her gaze, looking for the reflection from the other mirror. A barely visible cap encloses her blonde hair, and the glass jar rests on a window sill, just as in Bellini's painting. In this entirely private space, the young man and the woman's seductive modesty depict a narrative situation quite different from that of Bellini. Yet the underlying theme is identical. A woman who enjoys looking at herself in the mirror and her suitor who puts himself at her service without her even glancing at him. To understand this painting, Petrarch's sonnet can be complemented by a passage from Ovid, well known to Petrarch himself, where the theme of a beautiful woman pleased to look at herself in a mirror intertwines with that of her suitor, ready to be her slave, servire puelle on verse 1. Titian's painting is an exquisitely pictorial and intensely poetic response to Bellini's. Its true model are the responsive sonnets, a literary form extensively practiced by Italian poets, including Petrarch and, in Titian's time, Pietro Bembo. As a rule, a poet first wrote a sonnet addressed to another poet, who then customarily responded with a sonnet on the same theme and with the same rhymes. This is exactly what happens in these two paintings. The theme is the same, a beautiful woman at her mirror. And in Titian's responsory painting, the role of rhymes is played by details such as the two mirrors, the dark interior, the glass vase, her blonde hair. These two paintings therefore compete not only with each other, but also with a high-level poetic tradition. Therefore, both might be called poesie, like Titian's much later cycle, though not in the same vein. What is more, they require and trigger around themselves a network of gazes and discourse, including, alongside the painter and the patron, also his guests, intent on discussing their invention and composition. As early as 1501, Venetian artists explicitly challenged the boundaries between painting and poetry, as shown by Jacopo de Barbari's letter to the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. Jacopo maintained that a good painter, quote, for the invention of his works needs poesia, that arises from grammatic and rhetoric as well as dialectics, unquote. Therefore, he goes on, painting deserves to be acknowledged as a liberal art, and indeed the first among them all. Even themes from the Bible could be transfigured by the same lyrical and evocative thrust found in secular paintings. Such is the stunning mocking of Noah, a prime example of Bellini's late style. Given its oblong format and its composition, this painting, though on a sacred theme, could never be hung in a church. It must have been instead a quadro da portego, meant for the central hall or portico on the first floor of a Venetian palace, a space consistently devoted to forms of self-representation. The subject is based on Genesis, and I quote, Noah drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. His son Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren, and Shem and Japheth took a garment and covered the nakedness of their father. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him, and he said, Cursed be Canaan, and so forth. Ham, laughing at his father, is at the center here, while his siblings on either side cover Noah with a red cloth and turn their heads away so as not to see his shame. This subject was relatively familiar in Venice, thanks to an imposing life-size sculpture still very visible at the corner of the Doge's Palace. Yet Bellini's unique composition imbues this scene with a radically different significance. At the Doge's Palace, Noah's sculpture belongs to a large cycle, 3 high reliefs and 36 capitals, centered on the notions of justice and transgression, while Bellini's painting, by isolating a single scene, directs our attention to its ambiguities, which still cause discussion among scholars. The drunken old man, one of his sons mocking him while the other two behave respectfully, a bunch of grapes, an empty wine cup, the vines in the background, everything form a seemingly anecdotal scene. As in Erasmus 1522, Godly Feast, this might be a warning against getting drunk, a suitable theme for a portico. Yet, this theme also points to a tradition of biblical exegesis, paralleling Noah with Christ, such as in a much-loved work of popular theology from early 14th century, still very popular in the 15th century, i.e. the mirror of human salvation. Its basic assumption, called typology, was that key facts mentioned in the Old Testament prefigure or foretell the redemption as featured in the Gospels. The speculum therefore paralleled every New Testament event with 3 episodes drawn from the Old Testament. Hundreds of illuminated manuscripts and printed books thus show the mocking of Noah as one of the parallels for the mocking of Christ. Hovering between the sacred and the profane, this canvas well represents the poetic ambiguity that flourished in Venetian painting in the early 16th century. Its theme is secularized, but at once re-sacralized, with a vibration of meaning meant to challenge the beholder by providing the emotions of uncertainty and the pleasure of discussion. The elder Bellini contributed raising the status of painting by endowing his works with an exquisitely poetic tone, as shown by his lengthy negotiations with Isabella d'Este, who wanted the painting from him at all costs for her Camerino in Mantua, and eventually ended up granting him, in conversation with Pietro Bembo, quote, the full burden of the inventiva poetica, of poetic invention, or the composition of the poesia. Pictorial invention and composition were thereby understood as imbued, even identified with poetry, poesia. Giorgione is considered the outright champion of such an elusive yet captivating mode of representation. He often experimented with unprecedented compositions arranged along a deliberately evocative, expressive register. His style of thought, aimed at exploring the emotional potential of his subject matters, often led to enigmatic creations inviting guesswork and intuition. Let's look first at the three philosophers. Its title is based on its oldest mention, 1525. Quote, an oil painting with three philosophers in the landscape, two standing and one sitting and contemplating the sun's rays with a wonderfully painted cavern, unquote. It is striking how much prominence this description gives to the cave, and indeed, it originally occupied half of the painting before a significant portion was cut away from the left side. According to a likely interpretation, the only one I will mention here, we are looking at the three kings in front of the cave of Adam's treasure, observing the uncertain light of the star and the setting sun to determine the moment of the coming of the Messiah. In the first version of the painting, evidenced by X-rays, the elder philosopher, here right, wore a distinctive diadem or tiara unparalleled in 15th or early 16th century Italian art, with one single exception, a Holy Family with donors by Carpaccio, dated 1505, where one of the three kings sports a similar headdress. Unless evidence of such a headdress can be found elsewhere, this corroborates the identification of the subject, at least in the first version of Giorgione's painting, where understanding the subject was much easier. Erasing the exotic diadem meant on the other side making its interpretation more difficult, more privileged. Now, as shown by Monica Schmitter, the three philosophers was one of four quadri da Portego in house of a wealthy patrician, Taddeo Contarini. Schmitter's archival investigation also found that the adoration of the Magi was one of the most common themes among Portego paintings, and also Carpaccio's panel likely belonged to this category. Giorgione's canvas could therefore be an unusual variant of a commonplace subject, that of the three kings, a variant which painter and patron must have agreed upon. Iconographic experimentation was congenial to Giorgione. Even his self-portrait, whereby he acted as his own patron, is unconventional. A 1528 inventory lists it as the portrait of Zorzon by his own hand, as David and Goliath. The full composition is only preserved in Hollar's etching, which retains Goliath's severed head cut off in all other derivations, including Federico Zuccari's outstanding drawing in Prague. If Goliath's head was so disturbing to be suppressed, it is presumably because Giorgione's intention in adopting such a novel iconography for himself were and are far from clear. Addressing Giorgione's oeuvre as a whole proves particularly challenging, both for the short trajectory of his life and for the similar nature of his work. Moreover, very few among his paintings, such as the 1506 Laura, can be firmly dated. Only over the last 2 years of his life, 1508 to 1510, Giorgione won public commissions, but the frescoes from the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, where Titian worked with him, are very poorly preserved, while his paintings for the Doge's Palace are entirely lost. His is an atypical career of a master who for most of his life had to make do only with private patrons. Whether his major turning point, from private to public commissions, resulted in a clear stylistic shift is still a matter of debate among scholars. The enormous expressive distance between two paintings, such as The Tempest and The Mocking of Samson, both of which were in the same house in Venice in mid-16th century, makes it difficult for us to accept the attribution of the later of them. On the other hand, research on Giorgione has focused, thanks mainly to Sandro Ballarin, on a detailed sorting of the master's oeuvre according to a tight chronological sequence compatible with the brevity of his life, traditionally considered to be from 1478 to 1510. Things, however, changed a year ago when Jane Anderson published the last page of an incunabulum in Sydney with a Madonna likely drawn by Giorgione and a manuscript note giving his age 36 on the day of his death, September 17, 1510. He was therefore born probably in 1474. Extending Giorgione's life by 4 years at least, this document calls for a revision still to be done of many proposed dates for his paintings, including those mentioned in my lecture. Giorgione's representational strategies and his choice of unusual compositional devices wouldn't be conceivable without a close dialogue with his patrons. We must therefore address his works within the framework of a community of patrons and artists, including Bellini and Titian, who shared an experimental thrust for new and sometimes obscure modes of expression. But before tackling this point, let's offer one more example, Giorgione's sunset landscape here at the National Gallery. Beyond its conventional title coined by Longhi, what is the subject of the painting? In this airy landscape, something is actually happening. If we look carefully, we will notice first 2 pilgrims in the foreground, then a knight killing a dragon, a bearded hermit in a cave, a hog beneath him, and 2 monsters. As Jill Dunkerton carefully described in the National Gallery Technical Bulletin, part of the canvas was extensively and sometimes impertinently restored. Does this mean that the small figures in the painting have been invented from scratch? By no means. As shown by Jill Dunkerton, the 2 men in the foreground do belong to the original painting. Moreover, the hermit's head, shoulders, and arms are partially original, number 1 on the screen. The hog, number 2, was repainted starting from some original ginger eyebrows. The monster at the center of the pond is almost entirely repainted, notwithstanding, quote, tantalizing fragments of original paint. Then, number 3, the sinister little beaked demon emerging from the water, I'm quoting, is unquestionably original and almost undamaged. Number 4, most of the figure of the knight killing a dragon was repainted based on scant remainders, including number 5, a shape which suggests a helmet and the highlight on the back of the knight's armor, and number 6, the dragon's tail. We may therefore assume that the restorations, though admittedly excessive, did mostly follow, and very importantly, under the guidance of Roberto Longhi, traces and clues offered by the canvas itself. Therefore, it definitely makes sense to ask what this painting may be about. However restored, let's name who these figures are intended to be. The knight is meant to be St. George, and the hermit St. Anthony Abbot with his usual attribute, the hog, while the monster hints at his temptations. The bearded man tending a youth's leg is less easy to identify. Proposed interpretations include the Good Samaritan or Saint Roch, cured of the plague. But what could these disconnected episodes in a doubtful preservation state mean? Tiny narrative scenes were a standard feature in altarpieces, providing often in their predella a visual commentary on the main painting, as in Bellini's monumental Pala di Pesaro. Yet, scenes that might have taken place in a predella were occasionally moved into the main field of the painting, thus providing an evocative presence of saints. Such are St. George and St. John Evangelist in Memling's wing of a diptych in Paris, or the 5 narrative scenes from the life of as many saints featured in Mantegna's panel in Boston. Above left, St. Francis receives the stigmata, while in a cave just below, St. Jerome with his lion kneels in front of a crucifix. Lower down, St. Peter Martyr meets his murderers. To the right, St. Christopher crosses a river, while St. George slays the dragon by its bank. By scattering tiny narrative scenes all throughout the pictorial space, the painter directs our attention not so much to the saints represented as to the landscape in which they occur. By comparison, Giorgione's sunset landscape represents a quite unusual step. The main figures on the foreground are suppressed, and the tiny narrative scenes are promoted to a new role of protagonists. The compositional hierarchies are reversed, and the perceptive strategies suggested to the beholder change accordingly. We are first captivated by the landscape with its detail, trees, rocks, clouds, village, a setting sun. Next, we notice animals and human figures and are expected to recognize them as we mentally frame each little scene in a separate window of perception. Light and shadow invite protracted observation and gradual understanding. This is not a casual snapshot, but rather a paysage moralisé, as shown both by its poetic tone and by the exemplar placed within it. The pictorial rules of the game are manipulated by choosing unusual themes or introducing unexpected details. The inventions conceived in this spirit were aimed at highlighting moments, aspects, and emotions hitherto little explored, calling for novel, introspective keys to interpretation. The painter's compositional devices, to be effective, had to respond to the explanatory habits at work in the viewer's brain, and this is why unraveling each invention meant increasing the pleasure of looking. A rich literary culture was mobilized to enrich landscapes, gestures, and situations with metaphorical values. The boundaries between a subject and its ethical meaning was often infringed, and each theme was renewed from within, adding novel emotional dimensions through evocative, analogical, and associative modes borrowed from poetic and rhetorical conventions. The experimental nature of paintings like this, which almost look issued from a self-conscious avant-garde, can hardly be overemphasized. It prompted the highly refined painterly technique of Venetian's master to rise to its new tasks by elaborating stylistic novelties suitable for subjects never seen before. Giorgione is often regarded as the initiator of what David Brown called an artistic revolution, the invention, and I quote, of a new type of painting that aimed to rival poetry in its evocative power. Yet, a number of artists were part of it, including not only the old Bellini and the young Titian, but also Palma Vecchio and Sebastiano del Piombo. Their pictorial introspection addressed issues of body and soul, landscape and solitude, love and beauty, desire and suffering, sin and virtue. Yet, who first introduced these new modes of representation is not as important as their collective and supra-personal nature. A new style of thought affecting both sacred and secular subjects was shared, alongside the artists by patrons engaged in the same emotional horizon. Without this wider circle, such a commitment on the part of the painters would be unthinkable. We can therefore pinpoint in early 16th century Venice, what I would call an interpretive community, as defined by the literary theorist Stanley Fish, including painters and patrons. A given interpretive community encompasses creators and recipients of texts or images and implies both a strong authorial intent and shared conventions that orient the reception within a given horizon of expectations. On the other hand, the notion of interpretive community can be enriched and complemented by that of emotional community, brought forward by the medievalist Barbara Rosenwein. It applies to communities that share emotional reactions to things or events, including, quote, modes of emotional expression that they expect, encourage, tolerate, or deplore, i.e., in our context, a process of achieving, through pictorial means, a transfiguration of sacred and profane subjects into facts of inner life. The Venetian interpretive emotional community we're talking about presumably shared the literary culture and aesthetic taste and perhaps a spiritual inclination. But how could we express in the language of their time the nature of the pictorial revolution achieved by Giorgione and his fellow painters? Their deliberate violation of representational conventions and their propensity for compositions, only understandable through intensified and prolonged observation, can best be covered by the vocabulary of rhetoric, the overarching intellectual discipline that permeated the high culture of their time. Rather than on metaphor or allegory, let's focus on the rhetorical figure of hyponoia. It was defined by Aristotle as the covert intention and meaning of a text, or as in Plutarch, of an image, buried beneath its literal surface. Hyponoia, hypo, underneath, nous, mind. Hyponoia covers both the concealment of meaning by the author and its recovery by the reader or viewer. In Gerald Brown's words, it is, quote, the deeper, higher, or additional thought residing in what looks dark or contrary to reason, or yet different from usage, custom, or expectation. Unusual or surprising elements, which at first sight are an obstacle to understanding, on closer inspection reveal something familiar. In other words, this is a memory-based epistemology that triggers a process of recognition, discovering, and I'm also quoting Bruns, discovering the familiar in the strangeness of an alien text. Greek rhetoricians called this technique xenikon, i.e. strange, and indeed the estrangement or defamiliarization effect theorized by Viktor Shklovsky much later is a direct heir of classical rhetoric. Multiple and conflicting interpretations of a painting were an integral part of the rules of the game, as Giovanni Aurelio Augurelli, who was very close to Pietro Bembo, made clear. When in front of a painting, he writes, I'm quoting, many viewers express as many opinions without agreeing on any. This is even more appealing than the painting itself. Debating about competing interpretation of a painting finds its closest parallel in a literary subgenre, the commentary. This classical and medieval practice kept flourishing in Italian humanistic circles, for instance, around Petrarch's Canzoniere. Let me just remind you that Bellutello's commentary, published in 1525 in Venice, went through 20 editions. Humanistic commentaries offered a line-by-line explanation of poetry, yet they also implied rivalry with competing explanations in other commentaries, and therefore provided a good template for lively discussions like those mentioned by Augurelli. A further parallel to hyponoia-driven poetry and art is provided by the musica reservata, which aimed at intense emotional expression and was explicitly meant to be appreciated only by a few connoisseurs. Nicola Vicentino, who first described it in writing, drew a sharp distinction between music, quote, for the use of refined ears and that for the use of vulgar ears, unquote. An intensely poetic tone gives these inventions a fresh reality effect, while conveying a vibrant sense of intimacy through their elusive mood shared by Giorgione and the young Titian. This is why, as Vasari noted, the attribution of some paintings to either Titian or Giorgione fluctuated in their time, as, we must add, it still does in ours. The prevailing focus of many art historians on attribution practices results in losing sight of something far more remarkable than individual attributions, namely the supra-personal manner deliberately adopted by some painters to the point of achieving an almost interchangeable style, as it happened at other times in art history, Picasso and Braque around 1911, for instance. A few comments on two outstanding paintings by Giorgione may show, in conclusion, how a purposeful handling of hyponoia devices helped him transforming religious themes from within. As for The Tempest, I will not recap the interpretation I ventured into many years ago, but only mention some recent developments. The defining point of my conjecture was that this canvas may be read as a stylistic transfiguration, secularized yet rich in spiritual dimension of a biblical subject, i.e., Adam and Eve just driven out of Eden. The fact that the young man in The Tempest is dressed in contemporary clothes is not an argument against his interpretation as Adam. In a slightly older Venetian glass, as a matter of fact, we see Adam fashionably dressed even in the temptation scene. Likewise, unambiguous parallels can substantiate the interpretation of the deserted city in the background as Eden, as well as that of the lightning bolt in the sky as the voice of God condemning the original sin. Moreover, in a recent development, Sergio Alcamo identified for the first time a vital detail that had been overlooked by everyone, including myself. The tiny figure of an angel with outstretched wings standing alone on the bridge, as if guarding the deserted city. This otherwise inexplicable feature apparently confirms that the city may well be the inaccessible Eden, and the two characters in the foreground may well be Adam and Eve. However, landscape is the dominant aspect of this, as well as other paintings by Giorgione. By diluting a sacred story in an airy landscape, he embraced the poetics of introspection determined by the memory of Petrarch, for instance in his famous sonnet Solo e pensoso i più deserti campi, or in his canzone Di pensier in pensier, di monte in monte. Alone and thoughtful through the most desolate fields, the poet wanders along river banks, forests, shadowy valleys, and lonely slopes, thinking incessantly about Laura and his own soul. In this powerful poetic convention, the sought-after solitude in a vast landscape is conducive to reflection on himself, love, death, godliness as opposed to the material, transient world. To set scenes taken from the Bible or the lives of saints in such a frame was to draw them into the inner sphere, making them the object of intimate meditation. Petrarchan landscape in painting as in poetry provides consolation and invites imagination. Now, according to the earliest Venetian art theorist, Paolo Pino, quote, painting is true poesia. Therefore, painters should adopt the same principles followed by those who put their poesia in writing and introduce brevity, i.e. condensation, in their compositions, unquote. And indeed, Pino's passage, putting painting on a par with poetry, inspired the title of Janie Anderson's monograph on Giorgione, The Painter of Poetic Brevity. Let's now move in conclusion to a less known painting attributed to Giorgione's very last phase by Longhi. Its subject matter is controversial. In Gabriele Vendramin's collection, which also included The Tempest, it was inventoried as 3 large half-length figures singing by the hand of Giorgione, while later we find it described as, quote, a painting by Giorgione depicting a half-length figure of Samson while he is being mocked. He rests his hand on a stone and expresses regret for his cut hair. Behind him, 2 figures are making fun of him, unquote. As Longhi perceptibly pointed out, this is Giorgione's late style, likely informed by his work on a large scale for public commissions. But what about its subject? What main character puts his hand on has been convincingly identified as a musical instrument, a lira da braccio seen from behind. Should it then be a concert of 3 singing figures? Most probably not. Clearly, only one of these figures could really be singing, while another is laughing outright and the third keeps his mouth shut. But if not a concert, could this truly be a mocking of Samson? The mocking of Samson by the Philistines after Delilah cut his hair and he lost his strength is a rare subject in painting, yet it was commonplace as a typological illustration in the very popular Mirror of Human Salvation I already mentioned. Like the mocking of Noah, the mocking of Samson was considered an Old Testament prefiguration of the mocking of Christ, and therefore lent itself to a poetic representation as a highly emotional moment. The lira da braccio perfectly fits with this reading. According to the Vulgate, Samson played ludebat in front of the Philistines while they were merry. The Latin ludere, like the English play, may stand for playing a musical instrument. Hence a moral or allegorical meaning. The mighty Samson, forced to singing on command, as his enemies make fun of him, prefigures the mocking of Jesus. Then Samson will recover his strength and conquer the Philistines. Jesus will triumph over death. Giorgione relied here on the dramatic close-up of half-figures compositions, a device common in 15th century religious iconography and intended to summon viewers into the space of the painting. The resulting estrangement effect translates into a deeper involvement of the viewer. Samson is so imposingly central because it prefigures Christ, and his open mouth may also be calling for God's help. For the patron, such a painting might have represented Christ's passion, but also Samson's strength or passions, or as the power of prayer. Longhi's comment on this painting that Giorgione, quote, loved dealing with biblical subject matter by veiling it in an almost esoteric spirit, this comment by Longhi seems appropriate, the more so as it was written in 1944, long before any interpretation of Giorgione in terms of hidden subject or hyponoia had been proposed. A few weeks after Giorgione's death, an agent of Isabella d'Este, who had tried to buy some of his paintings on her behalf, wrote back from Venice that the owners didn't intend to sell them, quote, because those paintings had been made on their request to be enjoyed by them only. Like The Tempest, this mocked Samson is one of those works conceived for very demanding patrons who, like the painter, loved pictures endowed with poetic intensity and therefore suitable for introspection, private piety, and meditation. The Concert Champêtre, even in its oscillating attribution, represents well many of the points I was talking about. There is much more here than meets the eye. Do the figures gathered in conversation and music belong to dream, metaphor, or myth? Are the 2 naked girls perhaps apparitions, or fantastic projections of man's desire, or are they goddesses conjured up by a magical we cannot hear? In any case, the interplay between landscape and figures, elegantly dressed men, and even more elegantly naked women, the silence of nature and the delicately suggested music portray a poetic conception of nature as a mirror of the human soul, a living theater of feelings and emotions. When Titian, many years later, engaged in correspondence with Philip II about the poesie brought together by the National Gallery in a memorable exhibition, much time had passed since the Concert Champêtre. The great freedom the king allowed him, if compared with the limited autonomy reluctantly granted to Bellini by Isabella d'Este, shows how significantly the emancipation of artists had progressed in the meanwhile. Venetian culture of early 16th century decisively contributed to this process through an intense conversation within an interpretive, emotional, artistic community that concurred in assimilating the work of the painter to that of a poet. Though aware of this Venetian peculiarity, Vasari was ill at ease when defining it. Writing about Sebastiano del Piombo's early Roman works, just after he arrived from Venice in 1511, Vasari's first edition tells that Sebastiano did, quote, cose poetiche, in that manner which he had brought from Venice, very different from that used in Rome, while in the second edition, the cose poetiche squarely became poesia. When writing to Philip II, old Titian so often used the word poesia for the cycle of paintings he was working on, Titian was still in tune with the memories of his youth. Titian's word poesia, while occasionally synonymous with favola, carries with it the ambition of enshrining painting among the liberal arts by imbuing it with poetic nuance and density. As pointed out by Gianfranco Folena in a seminal paper on Titian's writing, poesia in his vocabulary directly stems from the meaning given to the same word half a century earlier by Isabella d'Este, Pietro Bembo, and Giovanni Bellini. Poesia as a category of pictorial creations, Folena goes on, implies, and I quote, the full mastery of the subject, not as an illustrative representation, but as a symbolic composition and interpretation, peaking in Titian's powerful insight, this is a quotation from Folena, peaking in Titian's powerful insight of landscape, not as a background, but as the breath and color of the fleeting hour. Expanding the scope of landscape to include poetic introspection actually meant highlighting the transitory nature of human emotions. No one can doubt that Titian's late style in his poesia and elsewhere was defined by a cultural horizon far removed from that of his early youth. All the more so if Thomas Putfarken is right to see in his later paintings the resonance, however indirect, of classical tragedy and the discussion on Aristotle's poetics. Yet, the cycle for Philip II would never have been called poesie by Titian himself if, at the beginning of the century, a hitherto unthinkable poetry in painting had not been pioneered in Venice by Bellini, Giorgione, and by Titian himself, who, in conversation with their patrons, formed a community of thoughts and emotions that actually would deserve to be further explored. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Settis, for this fascinating lecture. There's so much to think about here. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful having articulated some of the thoughts that are only sort of very vague in my mind about this subject, about this extraordinary period in Venetian art around the turn of the century in the first decade or two. I unsurprisingly have quite a few questions. I'm thinking about maybe if we start with the term poesia and maybe also think about the term favola, and because I get a sense that everything that you've explained remains true until like when Titian, I mean, it clearly is part of Titian's thinking when he's composing his pictures for Philip, but it seems mostly to be used in the intervening decades, to be used, and indeed by Titian, to be used for secular paintings and not for religious. Whereas what you describe really, and I think very interestingly, applies or could apply equally to religious paintings. So is there, what weight do you put on the aspect of poesia as just a genre, a descriptor of a genre, a secular kind of picture that draws on classical poetry, and what can be extended further into thinking about painting itself, the way Titian clearly did, not just with his secular paintings, but also his religious paintings.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, which is very important, of course. What I would say is that rather than a genre, I would think that what they started articulating in some way at the beginning of 16th century Venice, as shown by Jacopo de Barbari in his letter I mentioned in my lecture, is that it's rather a mode of addressing a given subject, and that the very use of the word poesia, which is a very vague word, we have to be very clear on that. Poesia is not a very technical word, as many others might have been. It's a very vague word. Nevertheless, it was in articulating a discourse about the possibility of making topoi or motifs migrate from poetry made of words to made of colors. This was very useful in order to put those two very different practices, artistic practice, we would say today, on more or less the same level, which meant in the cultural horizon of that time, in some way emancipating or contributing to emancipate the art of painting from their artisanal or craftsmanship sort of value. So I would say that the reason why I think that the word poesia in this sense, in this very vague sense, but at the same time with some precision in mixing, in legitimating the migration of the same topos from Petrarch to a painting about landscape, for instance. I think that in this respect, it's rather a mode of representation rather than properly a genre.
Right, and it wouldn't apply to religious painting, at least when you use the word. Obviously, it applies in terms of the creative approach, but when you use the word, because the biblical text is not the same as poetry. Is that what you mean? It doesn't prompt the same kind of interpretation.
It prompts the same kind of interpretation. For instance, let's look at landscapes. Whether a landscape is in a religious painting or in a secular painting, the introspective value of the painting, as suggested by Petrarch primarily, and I'm focusing I focused only on Petrarch, but of course I could say the Petrarchan poetry of Pietro Bembo or others in the late 15th and early 16th century. If the representation of landscape, a poetic representation of landscape is possible according to an introspective value as derived from Petrarch and is legitimized from by the very common, very popular reading of Pecular. Vellutello's commentary in written in very early 16th century was published in Venice 20 times. 20 different. So everybody would read Petrarch, and everybody would imitate Petrarch, not just Pietro Bembo, of course. So I'm thinking of rather a generalized feeling, or a possible generalized feeling induced that imbued landscapes with introspection. And if this is true, why just landscape in secular paintings, and also in religious paintings, including those whose religious subject is not controversial at all, like the Brera Madonna we have seen at some point.
Yeah, it's just that it's not described generally in the sources as a poesia. It's described as a
no. I have no text. Well, I have no text so far.
That do that.
No text calling poesia, but the texts speaking about poesia as applied to painting are very few.
Absolutely.
And the most intense use of the word poesia in this respect, as applied to a painting, is in Titian's correspondence with Philip II. As Folena in his wonderful article said, there are very interesting things in that article, including the fact that Titian is the first one in Europe to use the word paesaggio.
Right. Okay. Sure. Yes.
It's paesaggio and it's poesia. The two novelties, the two linguistic novelties.
Yes.
Yet, though paesaggio is a new word for an old thing. In 1510, they would have said paese, not paesaggio. While poesia has a very significant, I believe, I would suggest a very significant precedent in the first and second decade of that century.
It's really what is it that is special about that particular period? Because it would seem to me, and it's fascinating to think about Titian, the way he is formulating the future of painting by looking to the past. I mean, he's not alone in that, but he's doing it very clearly. But that period, his formative years, it's really there that what you described, this kind of ambiguous approach to image making, where the meaning is not clear and is very obviously meant to encourage discussion. That seems to go away in following decades. It does not seem to be as obvious. It really is in that period. Why doesn't that continue?
Well, it's an exception. It's not something that it's not the sort of novelty that once introduced will last forever. But it's I've tried to adopt notions like interpretive community or emotional community, in order to define a small group of persons who shared this common culture, and who were eager at finding a way of expressing a sort of intellectually aristocratic, not from the point of view of being more or less belonging to the proper aristocracy at the helm of the Venetian state, but to an aristocratic and sophisticated way of thinking that resurfaces here and there, also in ancient sources, and the very concept of hyponoia I've been insisting upon is a concept derived from ancient rhetoric. In given conditions, a small group be formed who want to be to express themselves in some way that is not generally intelligible, but it's intelligible within people and to people like them. To people like them. This is equally true of poets. Why the poems of Petrarch made commentaries be published immediately after. Even in Petrarch, some poems, some sonnets of Petrarch are very clear. Some other ones are filled with very fine, very subtle allusions to classical poets or to strange mythologies, and sometimes they are not yet identified. There is still a lot of discussion about them. And let me add one point which I didn't mention in the lecture for sake of time, and the text by Augurelli saying when we are in front of a painting and there are many opinions and no one agrees on what the painting, this is
fascinating.
This is much more pleasant than the painting itself. This is in a letter to Pietro Bembo. This is a letter to Pietro Bembo. So this is exactly the same circle and the same group of people that we are talking about.
I think you talked about super personal style and sort of the elimination of personal style in a way, but is it, I mean, that is where I may have a problem with this, because it seems very much to be the power of personalities here. It's the artistic personality of Giorgione, it's Bembo, it's people like that who create this. And Titian, to me, is not really in line with this. He very quickly moves in a much more, I mean, a very different direction that is not as ambiguous. And it's not, I mean, he takes it and uses it for something else. I think very interestingly with the Poesia, which have these very transgressive subjects, you know, of violence and rape and all these things. And it's been very interesting talking to people about the pictures and how they can contain different meanings. You know, like the Rape of Europa can be at the exact same time be ecstatic and horrifying. And one doesn't negate the other. And Titian seems to have learned that from the period, but he doesn't have this this ambiguity where you can't identify the subject. Or
you are perfectly right. So let me. I think there are two different components in your question. One component is that actually the cultural horizon when Titian works at the Poesia is totally different from that of the very beginning of the century. And here I rapidly mentioned Putfarken's idea of tragedy and Aristotle's. And so forth. So this is a different poetic tradition. It's always poetry, but poetry of a different sort. And I think that while Putfarken, in order to argue for his thesis, focused exclusively on a couple of decades in around 1550, which is fine. I'm fine with that. Yet, we don't have, we cannot forget that Titian was the same Titian who at the very beginning of the century, and he kept, he must have had an absolutely incredible memory in every respect. So he might have, in using the word Poesia, he might have he might add to this word a nuance that came from his youth. And second point, implicit in your question, or explicit in your question, I don't mean to dilute or to negate the individual personalities of painters. I'm not saying that it's not important to distinguish Giorgione from Titian. As much as possible, it is important to distinguish it. But I think that there is another component. While we are trying to distinguish Giorgione from Titian, we are at the same time, if we only do this, and if we don't focus on the very difficulty of distinguishing among them, I had prepared a list of attribution of the concert Champêtre, and the number of attributions of scholars attributing it, I think this is by Titian, but the number of scholars attributing it to Giorgione is almost the same one, and there are very good scholars attributing a part of the Tempest to Titian.
Right. Yeah. It gets very difficult.
And as some of the Venus in Dresden, Morelli attributed it first to Giorgione, but Vasari says that a portion of it is by Titian, and now many scholars attribute it to Titian. I think in this case it is Giorgione, but I think that whatever it is, and we can keep discussing whether it is Giorgione, but the very fact that there is an overlapping area, a gray area between one painter and another, and that this very area corresponds to, or might correspond to this circle of sophisticated connoisseurs avant la lettre, whose relationship was not the one linked to the market that we are thinking about, but rather a connoisseurship linked to literature, linked to philosophy, linked to religious feelings, pre-Reformation religious feelings, which were in a sense inclined towards what later would come the two variants of Reformation, Protestant Reformation and Catholic Reformation. So I think that this component should be taken into account in looking at the vast and extremely sophisticated landscape of that particular period.
I mean, it is astonishing how difficult it is and how much disagreement there is about attributions in a particular period. It's like no other period. It's like this period.
No other period. No other period. So this must be thematized as something important to think about as a component of what was going on. So
and it's not just, I mean, you wouldn't say, because the alternative or the counter argument could be that this is the power of Giorgione's personality, that, for example, Titian emulates him until he gets to a point where he finds a way of doing it differently.
Well, I think this explanation, which is the traditional explanation, I find it less stimulating, less interesting, less significant than thinking that they were so close to one another, and they were working for the same patrons, not for the same physical person of the same patron, not necessarily for Gabriele Vendramin or others like him, but for the same circle for persons belonging to the same type, for persons who were expressing to them, to the painters, some sort of demanding characteristics they want with the paintings. And this is the famous letter of Taddeo Albano to Isabella d'Este, when he says they had them made, they asked Giorgione to make the painters for them, because they want to be pleased by them, and so they will never sell them for any price. So that's something which is reflected also in the testament of Gabriele Vendramin, among other things.
Right. This is absolutely fascinating. I think also the coupling of the drunkenness of Noah, Bellini's drunkenness of Noah, with this kind of thinking, I think is fascinating. I just, one more thing before we open this up to general questions. I just wanted to ask about a specific, very sort of, I mean, maybe a bit nerdish element, but Janie Anderson's discovery of this document, or like with some other people, which antedates, if we believe the document, and it seems very convincing to me, but it antedates Giorgione's birth by 4 years. What consequences does that have for us thinking of his career? I think my impression is that it's still very difficult to identify work before 1500 by him. And what did he come late to painting, do you think? Is that a way of explaining it? Or is it just that we've lost it and we can't find it?
I am really unable to respond at this point. First of all, when I've seen this paper by Jenny Anderson, I've been looking at it very seriously with a friend who is a paleographer. I don't have the slightest doubt that this is absolutely authentic. That this is absolutely authentic, and you know, there are scholars who think that the drawing is by Giorgione, but the writing, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't. I think that the writing, the document is absolutely authentic. I find it wonderful that.
Absolutely, it's fantastic.
It
Finally, something like a date.
It emerges in Sydney. That's absolutely wonderful. That's, that's something what in now globalized civilization, something like this might happen. And but I think that a great effort has been put, particularly by Sandro Ballarin, in dating Giorgione's painting almost
earlier,
not by year, by season, almost by month, almost by weeks. Once we have his life prolonged by 4 years, will this change the chronology at some point? It will take some time before being able to respond to this. And my specialty is certainly not that of dating paintings so carefully. And even great art historians such as Longhi and Ballarin on the Samson they disagree. For Longhi it is 1510, and for me, I think that Longhi is right, while for Ballarin it should be 1508. Now, once Giorgione's life is 4 or 5 years longer, what does it imply? I don't know so far, and we never had to forget that only the Laura and the Fondaco frescoes are dated.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just thinking, is it something like Catena, who like he had money somehow? I mean, I know that we don't have the same kind of evidence, but that he just started painting late, as a
This is quite possible. This is quite possible. But I think it will take some time before actually being able. It will take some time, and certainly a lot of controversy about this. So I think that the first reaction of some scholars is saying this document is not true. This document is a fake or something. It's just a very understandable reaction. I don't want to think about it. I don't want. It reminds me when the first traces of polychromy in Greek sculpture were resurfacing, and there was a Scottish, I think, architect who said, "I don't want to look at them. Even if they're there, I don't want to look at them."
The implications are simply too big.
To keep thinking about Greek architecture and sculpture as totally white. This is what we are thinking about. I think that this is very understandable and culturally very interesting, not necessarily true, though.
Right. I think we will open to the audience now. Gabriele.
Hello again. Thank you so much, Matthias and Salvatore, for that discussion after the talk. I'm just going to pick up a few of the questions that have come through, if I may. Here's a question in relation to the new mode of painting called poesia. Did the new mode of painting, poesia, have an influence on painting outside of Venice?
I would say that's a very difficult question, but I would say that that Venice, I would characterize it, as far as I know, Venice as the birthplace of this thing. And a passage by Vasari about Sebastiano del Piombo, when he says that Sebastiano would paint cose poetiche, as they used to do in Venice, very different from Rome, it could be interpreted in this way. This doesn't mean that from Venice there was no influence on painting in northern Italy, more probably than in Tuscany or Rome.
Another question asks, what was specifically new about Giorgione and Titian's landscape? You referred to the invention of this word paesaggio rather than paese, which is how landscapes had been previously described. And another question asks about this device of a tree that appears in the middle of many of these compositions, if it has some special significance.
Well, the isolated trees that appear here and there, I don't know for sure, and nobody knows, but one possible interpretation that they are a device meant to encourage identification of the viewer with an isolated presence in this landscape. As for the specificity of the landscape in painters like Giorgione or Titian, I think that it is not just in the use of the word paesaggio in Titian, but is also in a number of nuances and of delicate details that are scattered here and there, and that invite the beholder to enter the landscape and to identify with the landscape. And I think that in this respect, the real master of describing landscapes, natural landscapes, which are mirroring the interior landscape, the landscape as introspection. I think that there is a great effort made by those painters, which will then become very common in Renaissance art in Italy, and not only in Italy.
Thank you. Ken, another question says, could you say something more about the significance of the mirrors in the very first picture that you showed, The Lady at Her Toilette by Giovanni Bellini? Anyone who loves the National Gallery and knows the collection, of course, is familiar with one of the most famous mirrors anywhere in the world, which is Velázquez's Venus at Her Toilette, but in particular on the Giovanni Bellini.
Of course, we have, I think that Giovanni Bellini's painting in Vienna is really the earliest representation of a woman with a mirror in painting. This is a literary topos that from Ovid on, and perhaps even before Ovid, I didn't check this, which is absolutely very common, and in Petrarch is in these two sonnets and perhaps somewhere else, but particularly in the two sonnets I mentioned. And the second sonnet, this is another thing. I think that the second sonnet is particularly linked with the paintings by Bellini and Titian, because there is the plural, mirrors, e più ne colpo, i micidiali specchi, in the plural. Then after Bellini and Titian, and I believe that Titian responds to Bellini, while Ballerin thinks that Titian comes before Bellini. But I think that in this case, I greatly admire Ballerin, but I think that in this case, it can only be explained as Titian responded to Bellini and not the reverse. After that, there are hundreds but at the same time, at the very time of these two paintings, there is also the two sonnets by Baldassarre Castiglione, I Sonetti dello Specchio, where, and we know that there are paintings of beautiful women with a mirror in front of them, and the mirror could be removed and see the painting. And the Sonetti dello Specchio by Baldassare Castiglione, dated I think 1513. So it's exactly the same time was were relating to one of this portrait plus mirror. So there was there was something very secretly, and there was something that's only a few people would deeply understand, because they shared some sort of avant-garde of thinking, though avant-garde is a totally anachronistic concept.
Salvatore, one more question for you, and then we'll draw to a close. Somebody who was very keen on your talk and said, do you have, as somebody who has studied Giorgione for many decades, do you have advice for an illustrator and artist who is studying Giorgione?
That's a very difficult question. I must say that I discussed it once with an important Italian artist, Guttuso, who had read my book, and then he wanted to meet me. It was the only time I met him. And then he said, and we spoke about the Tempest, and then he wrote a couple of things derived from Tempest. My suggestion would be rather to look at the Tramonto in the National Gallery, because it is such a mysterious painting, and there is also such a discussion about restoration and not restoration. But the real point I would do, if I were an artist, which I'm not, would be to look at the delicacy of some details, particularly in landscape more, but also in human figures, and to see whether expanding those details or going deeper in those details would produce a different type of illustration, or a different interpretation, a poetic interpretation proper of our time, not necessarily based on 16th century documentation.
Professor Settis, thank you so much for a fascinating, stimulating lecture, and for a lively and engaging discussion afterwards. And thank you for answering so many questions, both from Matthias and of course from the public who have been listening. The lecture that you've given will be published, I'm delighted to say. One or two people were asking about that, and we will try and make it available online in due course. But the lecture will be published, as indeed all the Linbury lectures at the National Gallery will. Could I just finish by saying thank you to colleagues in the control room at the gallery, Ash Baker, thank you to Joseph Kendra of the learning team for organizing the lecture. Thanks to Matthias. Can I remind people online that Joseph Kerner will be giving the next Linbury lecture on the 14th of May on Jura. But above all, may I finish the afternoon by saying thank you to you, Professor Settis. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. I'm sorry we couldn't show you the Titian exhibition. We are where we are. Good luck with the exhibition at the Capitoline Museums, and I hope we'll see you in London very soon. Thank you to you. Thank you to our audience. Good night.
Thank you to, and thanks to everybody. Thank you.